Well, it's 1 minute in advance, but I'm going to take advantage of the fact that people are getting quiet. You never know how long that's going to last. My name is Jim Hankins. I teach at Harvard in the History Department, and I have been a visiting fellow at the center here, where I became, I hope, in some way part of the family. I have the honor and privilege of introducing two distinguished Catholic thinkers and actors this afternoon. From the, well, I almost said the periphery of Britain, from Scotland, from Ireland, but I'm allowed to say that because I'm half Irish myself, so. All right, so but our first speaker is John Haldane, who is currently the J. Newton Razor Senior Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, all in one breath, at Baylor, and Professor of Moral Philosophy at University of St. Andrews in Scotland. While simultaneously being visiting professor in philosophy of education at the Jubilee Center University of Birmingham. Not University Center, but Center University. All right. So he's a rather famous guy who's supposedly one of the top 50 Catholic intellectuals. Who decided that? You're one of the...
Who knows? Yeah.
I hope it wasn't Newsweek, because it probably, in that case, would mean that...
It's worse than that. It's the tablet.
It's the tablet. Oh, that's all right. If it were Newsweek, it'd mean you're not to be read. But since it's a tablet, it means you're to be read.
Well, the tablet is sometimes known in some quarters as the bitter pill. So
I like that. Anyway, he is a very distinguished character, writes in very many. He's described, I read up on you, and they said you had invented analytical Thomism. And I was saying to myself, I thought Thomas is analytical all by himself. People say that, I guess. All right, so I will stop introducing him and let him speak. He's going to speak on civic friendship. Is civic friendship still possible? And if not, is society dead? But there's quotations around society dead, so he'll tell us all about that.
Thank you very much. With regard to that title, just a general point, since I'm a philosopher, every bit of it turns on what you mean by, right? So is civic friendship, it depends what you mean by it. Still possible, it depends what you mean by possible, and so on and such like, yeah. So first of all, let me just say, as other speakers have done on many occasions when beginning to make their contributions to this conference, it is a great pleasure to be back at Notre Dame, to be back at this conference. This is one of 2 or 3 conferences I know of in the world which now have this quality of a sort of family being reassembled. It's a somewhat extended family, but it feels a little bit like that. It's people getting back together who know one another, who've come to understand and appreciate one another in various ways. And it is, I know particularly, and this began in the earlier days under David Solomon, but continues now with Carter, that for many people, I think this conference is very important because it provides them for an opportunity, and it provides them with opportunities really to discuss matters in a way that's sort of open and free and encouraging among like-minded people, whereas much of their year may be spent in environments that are less conducive and congenial and encouraging and so on. So it's a great thing, and I'm very happy to be part of it. So the title is indeed, Is Civic Friendship Still Possible? And if not, is society dead? The notion of civic friendship is associated with Aristotle, and several speakers have had something to say about that, have quoted Aristotle or elaborated a little bit. The elements of friendship as Aristotle understands those. I will say something about that, but that is in part a scholarly question, and for reasons which I will make clear, I don't think that the notion of civic friendship should be thought of as a species of friendship quite in the way that Aristotle categorizes other kinds of friendship, but I'll explain what I mean about that shortly. I think the first thing to be said is to set the scene for this is to say I have been coming to the United States since the late 1980s, and over those years I've been continuously at the University of St. Andrews, but periodically I feel the need for an extended stay in the United States. And so I've held positions over the years, beginning at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1980s, and then Georgetown, holding a humanities chair there in the early part of the millennium, and then more recently in the center here at Notre Dame, now at Baylor, And it has been very interesting for me to observe the changing character of public debate in the United States over that period. My own background as a philosopher was in certain technical questions in the philosophy of mind and epistemology, but by stages I found myself migrating more into social and political philosophy because it seems to me there's an urgency, a cultural urgency attaching to those. The other countries that I know very well are my own, of course, the United Kingdom, but also Australia, where I've spent time, and to a degree Ireland, and we'll be hearing something about Ireland later on. And in each of these places I've observed something of the same movement, and that is a movement that has brought us to a position that is deeply conflicted. Clear antagonisms of various sorts that I don't need really to elaborate, that you'll be familiar with in public debate. The quality of public debate has degenerated in various ways. The antagonisms have become greater. In trying to understand why that should be so, it seems to me there are at least three kinds of analyses. One I would call the events analysis, or the episode analysis. One, the sort of social change analysis, and the third, sort of philosophical transformation analysis. So in each case, I think that to some extent, and these are combinable, I think that to some extent events have contributed to these changes. I'll mention a couple of those in a minute. I think to some extent broader sociological changes, social changes have made a very significant contribution to that. The dissolution of the traditional family, divisions opening up between classes, regions of the country and one thing and another. But I think also clearly changes in the way in which people conceive of human nature and of the values pertaining to human life and so on. All of these are a part of that. So I thought that actually I would begin by illustrating something of the, I said hopefully, something of the extent to which these matters have taken us. Sorry, I'm a Mac. Sorry, I'm a Mac user, not one a PC user. So let me just begin with a kind of extended anecdote. I mentioned that one of the places that I'm familiar with and have made contributions in public discourse in is Australia, and in Australia, I spent some months in Australia some years ago, and then again more recently last year. And in Australia, I've participated in public debates on television and on the radio and things of that sort, and in public fora. But I want to mention one in particular. And this was very interesting. It was a debate that was scheduled to be held at the Recital Centre in Sydney. Sydney has two major sort of musical venues. One, of course, is the Sydney Opera House, and the other one is the Sydney Recital Centre. So it was going to be a big event. And the topic that had been set for the debate was society must recognise transgender identities. That was the proposal, and then that was to be debated. The BBC were very interested in this, and they had contracted with ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, to record this. And so a team came in from London to Australia, or at least it was planned that a team would come from London to Australia and record this for BBC World, and but also edit a version down for ABC Australia. And plans were afoot, and these things, of course, take some time to organise. I had been asked, I think I wasn't in Australia at the time when the invitation came, but at any rate I'd agreed. When I got to Australia, people started saying to me things like, "Are you really sure you want to do this?" Because by that point, there was already rather a furore about the very idea that these matters should be debated. It was seen to be deeply offensive, a provocation, even to debate the question as to whether society must recognise transgender identities. Anyway, at that point, the Sydney Recital Centre were rather concerned about questions of security. There'd been threats of a bomb. I didn't think those were serious, but nonetheless, there was threats of violence. And there was a question as to whether or not they should, in fact, cancel the event. Now, I was approached at that point by The Guardian. So I don't know that there are two British newspapers that have a large presence internationally. One is the Daily Mail, which I think has the largest online readership of any British newspaper, and perhaps of any English language newspaper. It's a massive online readership, very widely read here in the United States. And it is, of broadly speaking, centre conservative disposition. The other one is The Guardian, which is a liberal newspaper. And so I was intrigued, pretty intrigued, but I was struck with the fact that the Guardian contacted me. So let me just see if I can find this. Yeah. So the Guardian contacted me. Sorry, let me just see. How do I open up the whole? Just a second. What I'd really like to do is get rid of the stuff on the right-hand side, but it doesn't matter. I'm not going to be. It doesn't really matter. That'll do. Okay. So the Guardian contacted me and said, look, we can see that this is all getting rather sort of heated. We gather there's talk of cancelling this debate. Would you be willing to write an article to be published the day before the debate, making the case for the debate to go ahead? Not making an argument on one or other side of the issue, but just arguing in defense of the possibility of discussing these matters in a public forum. So this was quite interesting. This is The Guardian, so a left-leaning paper. And interestingly, I wrote this article, and it was, well, you can see the title there, but if you look at the top left-hand corner, you'll see it's actually in their LGBT rights section of the newspaper. So the Guardian was quite happy, in fact, thought it was appropriate that there should be some discussion of this. Well, just let me give you a flavour, because I want to try to give a sense to people who may not be aware of this, of quite how fraught it can be to engage in public debate in these sort of settings. So what you're going to see next is a little bit of the beginning of this debate, well, not the debate itself, but the introduction of the debate. And what you will see is the extreme nervousness of those who are present. Well, you see two things, actually. One is the audience were massively bussed in by LGBT groups around Sydney and from further afield, actually, as far as Melbourne. And so it was an audience that was not merely, as it were, of one view, but clearly, many of them, they felt that they were giving witness and testimony, and indeed, in a way, it was intimidatory. And it was just that you'll see this in the faces in a minute. The other thing is that it was done under the auspices of something called Intelligence Squared, and the presenter on this occasion was himself extremely nervous and wanted to make clear that, he was trying to defend the very idea that these matters could be discussed. And then you'll see the parties who are going to be part of the debate. There's just one grinning idiot, and that's me, because I just generally do that. But the others, there's a sort of sternness in their faces, which you will see. So I think you'll enjoy this. You can see, of course, the whole thing at your leisure, but I'm only going to give you really the first minute of this. So here we go. And just hope that the volume. So, just need to check on. Let's see if volume comes up in a second. Sorry, people, hang on.
Hello, I'm Simon on the staff, and I'd like to welcome you.
Just one second. Can you hear this or not? No. So where's the sound coming out of in this? Does anybody know whether on a PC there's a volume control on the keyboard? There is on a Mac keyboard, but is there on a... But how do you turn... What?
Move the cursor to the speaker.
Sorry.
Here.
No, that's the internal volume of YouTube. I need actually the volume on this. Does anybody know about these?
It's up here. You have a microphone?
Yeah, that looks like it. Yeah, right. So let's try it now. Okay, let's try it. I'm not that bad. I can distinguish between the volume control internally, which evidently some of you can't. Right, okay. What did he say? All right.
Tonight we're going to be debating one of the most contentious issues we've ever presented, and we debate that society must recognise trans people's gender identities. Now, for many people, there really is no debate to be had. Yet, even in a relatively progressive society like Australia, transgender people, they report high levels of intimidation, harassment, and discrimination. And the effect of this is to have very high levels of serious depression. Now, society is trying to deal with this. You have programs in schools which are designed to educate people. There are various conversations taking place. But there's also been a movement to have no platforming of ideas and people who are deemed likely to offend. I'll give you one example of this which has recently been in the news. Consider the case of Germaine Greer, who faced intense hostility in Britain. And this is what she actually said. She said, "I don't think post-operative transgender men, male to female transgender people, are women." Now, Greer was labelled transphobic, and Other people have been too, religious and social conservatives, free speech advocates, and feminists who report being bullied and threatened. What it means is that no one on either side of this debate at the moment feels safe, respected, or happy. We're going to try and change that tonight with the tone of our conversation.
You see the smiling audience.
Joining us today, we've got some wonderful speakers. So, debating the motion that society must recognise transgender people's identities, we have Peter Hindle, who is a transgender policy and law reformer, all the way from the States, Andrea James, an LA-based transgender film director, writer and producer. Yeah, give them a clap for the affirmative.
So he is female to male and she is male to female.
And arguing against the debate, we have Bronwyn Winter, who's an Associate Professor of Gender and Human Rights Studies, and she's joined by John Haldane, an eminent Scottish Professor of Philosophy.
When in doubt, smile, right? But interesting. Now, here's the interesting thing. So in this debate, so on the left-hand side, you have a male to female and a female to male, and the woman who's adjacent to me is a very well-known lesbian feminist academic in Australia, and some of you will know that there's part of this war is between lesbian feminists and transgender males. Let me just try to see how do I do, just 1 second. So just to give you a sense of how this sort of evolved, I won't go into it, but there was a lot of subsequent discussion and so on, and then there was a television program in which I took part in some discussions around this. Not on the first order question about transgenderism, but about the permissibility and of discussing these sort of matters. And the notion I wanted to introduce and make quite a lot of, which I'll say something about later, is that of reasonable disagreement and understanding the nature of reasonable disagreement. But a year later, or thereabout a year later, I think, the Spectator magazine, so the Spectator magazine, some of you will know, I know there's an American Spectator, but the old Spectator dates from the 18th century, and there's an edition, an Australian edition of Spectator magazine, and this was an article in the Spectator a year after, I think it was about a year after the original debate had taken place. So you can see it's called It's War Dear. The Rainbow Coalition is splintering. And can you see that image? Yeah. So you can see the image there. And then what it starts, the interesting thing is, last year the Scottish philosopher John Haldane took part in the Sydney Ethics Centre debate, challenging the notion that society must recognise trans people's gender identities. Facing a hostile audience filled with Mardi Gras visitors, his reasoned arguments took issue with the coercion implied in that must. We need toleration, a principled reason, a principled response to difference, but toleration is not endorsement, he said. We need to hold back the forces of coercion. And then the article goes on and talks about what had happened in the year since that debate had taken place. Now, the thing about this is so part of the reason I'm giving you this is because it's just as it's an example which can be, as it were, elaborated in detail. You can see, you get access to aspects of this if you go on YouTube or if you follow these, just to see the trajectory of the discussion from a situation in which the threat was that this discussion must not even take place to one in which it having taken place. There's another article in The Guardian which was sort of supportive, not of my views about transgenderism, but which actually are somewhat ambiguous, but about the, or ambivalent, I should say, but about this question of discussion. So it was a quite important moment in a way, because had things gone the other way, the debate would never have taken place at all. So one thing that I took some satisfaction from was the fact that the debate took place. And the consequence of the debate taking place was that people started to discuss the question under what conditions should controversial matters be discussed. If we, however, go back to the earlier issue, I said, how did we get to this situation? And I mentioned the sort of cultural changes, philosophical changes, and events. If we had time and so on, I would want to illustrate this more. But I'll just mention one event, which is very interesting, and that is the funeral of Princess Diana. Now, just to give you a contrast, the impeachment proceedings of President Clinton attracted at most a television audience of 12 million. And that's a cumulative one. It wasn't simultaneously 12 million. It was over the course of the day at various stages and one thing and another. The funeral of Princess Diana was watched in Britain by 32 million people and worldwide live by 2.5 million people. What did I say? Did I say million? I meant billion, sorry. 2.5 billion people. This is one of the most watched events in human history, 2.5 billion people. Now, what I wanted to show you, but I don't think I had this set up earlier on, but then it sort of logged out and one thing and another. But anyway, if some of you, maybe some of those 2.5 billion are present today, I'm not quite sure. But there were two very significant moments in the whole affair. I don't know whether or not everybody's seen the film The Queen with Helen Mirren playing the part of the Queen. Yeah. Well, you'll know in the course of that there was very considerable tension between 10 Downing Street and the palace. At that point, the Queen was, as she is in the summer, she was spending the summer in Scotland, and so she was away from Holyrood Palace, which is the Edinburgh Palace of the Sovereign, but she was at Balmoral, which is a private estate. It doesn't belong to the Crown, it belongs to the royal family as a family. But anyway, if you've seen that film, you'll know there's a lot of toing and froing between Downing Street and the Queen's private secretary. And the upshot of this was that the Queen simply didn't want to. She just wanted to remain in Balmoral and not come to London, and felt that it wasn't really for her to be involved in all of this. And there was a growing sense that this was one of these moments of crises, as the abdication had been earlier in the 20th century, that threatened the monarchy. And so the Queen was persuaded to come to London, and some of you may have seen those images where she went round and looked at the flowers that were, had been placed in front of Buckingham Palace and so on. And there was an element of booing, which is unheard of. The next significant moment, which I don't know if I can show you, but was in Westminster Palace, Westminster Cathedral itself. Westminster Abbey, when Elton John played a version of the song that he'd written about Marilyn Monroe, but it now became a song about Princess Diana. And there's a moment of silence, and then I think her brother, Earl Spencer, was speaking, and then he talked about, effectively he had a go at the royal family. And then there's just this, if you remember this, the silence, the moment of silence, and then you hear this roar from outside, which are the hundreds of thousands of people outside Westminster Abbey. And it's a very tense moment, and you can see on the face of the royals real anxiety. I don't know whether it will come up in this. If it doesn't, I'd encourage you to. This is the gun carriage bearing the body of Princess Diana. Let me just see if we get to the point. You can get a flavour of the. I just wanted to show you inside the Abbey, but I don't think I can at this point. That's the. No, sorry. Let me try that. So these are people outside.
While she was a symbol of selfless humanity,
That's her brother speaking.
a standard bearer for the rights of the truly downtrodden, a very British girl who transcended nationality, someone with a natural nobility who was classless, and who proved in the last year that she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand.
That's a dig at the royal family.
There is no doubt that she was looking for a new direction in her life at this time. She talked endlessly of getting away from England, mainly because of the treatment that she received at the hands of the newspapers. I don't think she ever understood why her genuinely good intentions were sneered at by the media, why there appeared to be a permanent quest on their behalf to bring her down. It is baffling.
I can't play, sorry, for reasons of time, I'm afraid I just can't play any more of that. But it's very interesting to watch, and I count it as one of these moments. I mean, there are various others, the attacks on, the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon and the Twin Towers, the Clinton impeachment, the 2016 UK European Union referendum, the Trump election and so on, the hanging Chad's election of 2000 and such like. I think these events are very important because I think they're occasions on which a change that had been, as it were, going on in the past and to some degree unnoticed, occasionally noticed and so on, suddenly manifests itself. And you see in this particular event a very significant revelation about the state of Britain. It's become a highly emotive culture. There's a kind of what I would call emotive relativism. So relativism, you know, people complain about relativism, but typically what they have in mind is cognitive relativism, the idea that truth is, you know, what I say it is. But what's overtaken Britain, at any rate, is what I call emotive relativism. So it's not even, so people no longer say things like, I disagree with you, or I take issue with what you've just said. They'll say things like, that's very hurtful, or, you know, I'm offended by what you've said, and so on. So it's a kind of emotive relativism. And this was one of those moments in which I think a nation revealed what had happened to it over a number of decades, that it had gone from a nation that thought to a nation that felt. And the level of kind of emotional incontinence that was manifested on this occasion really is quite extraordinary. That's a whole, you know, a whole other story unto itself. Now, so let me get back to the issues in hand. I'm going to just put this off because it's a distraction. Distraction to me, at any rate. Now, some people think, as I said just now, that I'm talking about ideas, some people think that all of this has been caused by ideas. In 1948, Richard Weaver published a book called Ideas Have Consequences, and some of you may know Weaver's work. At the point when Weaver was penning his book, Jack Kerouac was writing the first of the notebooks that would eventually be typed up as the great scroll that became On the Road. And it's very interesting to read, although I don't have many of you read On the Road, but On the Road is a very curious book because on one hand it was seen as being the kind of testament to the Beat generation and the first sort of canonical text of the counter-revolution, but it is in fact a sort of manifest, I shouldn't use the word manifest, it's an expression of something like manifest destiny. It's a sort of re-expression of the 19th century American preoccupation with manifest destiny, but it's recast now at the level of the individual. It's not about a people and a promised land being given unto a people, it's about a promised land being given unto an individual. And there's a moment in the book where he's crossing the Utah-Colorado border, or I suppose Colorado-Utah border, and he talks about a golden cloud appearing in the sky, and he says that that cloud was pointing at him, and this was the finger of God. What does that mean, 2 minutes?
No, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The finger of God. So anyway, extremely interesting. Now, what people think that things like Jack Kerouac and other writers of the time set in motion a kind of cultural revolution, and that and that's the sort of thing that Weaver was warning us against when he said ideas have consequences. Be careful what you think because it will have a social effect. So my own view is that this gets things halfway wrong, halfway right perhaps, but halfway wrong. I think that ideas are consequences. It's natural for intellectuals to overemphasize the importance of ideas. But I think in a sort of Hegelian style that ideas are practice coming to the level of consciousness. That Goethe says, you know, he quotes in the beginning was the word, and then he says in the beginning was the sense, in the beginning was the, I can't remember what the third one is, but he said, but effectively I say to you, in the beginning was the deed. So I think that these transitions and these transformations are rooted less in ideas than they are in certain social practices. Now, very quickly moving. Aristotle, what I think this poses the question is, have things happened to these societies that make the possibility of their holding together, or put in question the possibility of their continuing to hold together? And I think the answer to that is yes. Question, what could be a response to that? Well, the idea of civic friendship might have some role to play in this. But I think that we can't simply apply Aristotle's analysis of friendship, carrying it over to the notion of civic friendship. I don't even think that in Aristotle that he thinks that civic friendship is exactly an instance of either utility friendships or excellence friendships or pleasure friendships, but that's a kind of scholarly question. But what I do think that we need to do is think about the conditions under which we engage in public debate. And I'll be very quick here. I mean, there's a lot to be said, but I'll just try to be very brief. I think that both sides in these debates, as well as the kind of, this is why it's so crazy, there's a kind of emotivism that's given up rational argumentation. But on the other hand, there's a preserved notion of argumentation which is that of strict demonstration. There's a sort of notion of argumentation that Aristotle has in the prior Analytics, and Aquinas subscribes to also, which is simply not credible. This is where you pass from self-evident premises via deductive inferences to certain conclusions. Now, I think we now know enough about the nature of meaning and the nature of knowledge to see that this isn't any longer credible. It's not even credible in areas where you might suppose it would be secure, like geometry, for example. I won't give examples of this. But I think that there's two things we have to sort of take on board philosophically here. One is, just to give them sort of their technical terms, one is semantic holism and the other one is epistemological holism. That words don't have meanings in isolation, they have meanings in the contexts of frameworks of meaning. Many more terms than we think of are actually theoretical terms. They're not observational terms, they're not terms that are given their meaning by intuition or experience in any direct sense. And I think that part of the difficulty of these debates is that they are deploying essentially contested concepts. That the notion of justice is part of, it's no good giving an argument based on justice, because the notion of justice is precisely part of what's in contention here. Likewise, it's no good appealing to experience or tradition in and of themselves. So, I mean, they have a role, but the point is they have to be understood holistically. That's to say, what seems to you plausible in the light of total experience, reflection, inheritance, of tradition, of testimony of others, and so on. And the upshot of all of this is that I think that we need to cultivate dispositions that are exercised in the context of debate, in which there's a sort of recognition of our condition. And that condition is partly existential, it's partly epistemological. The existential aspect of it is that, I put it in another context, we come into a world not of our own making, under conditions we didn't choose, in circumstances over which we have little control. But the epistemological variant of that is that we come into a world we don't really understand, under conditions in which it's very difficult to try to form an understanding, in circumstances in which we have to, as it were, to attend to others' struggle to understand as well. Now, this isn't relativism, it isn't abandoning certain views, but it is saying that we need to cultivate modes of discussion that move away from the idea of strict demonstration, because the idea of strict demonstration has the implication that if somebody doesn't agree with you, they're either stupid or wicked, right? And that isn't the case. So when people engage in these debates about transgender identities, it was no part of my argument that the people who took a different view were either stupid or wicked. These are difficult questions, and they have to be teased out and dealt with in kind of slow way. We need to slow down the thinking and so on. But doing that in a way, my experience has been that doing that in a way that grants respect to the other has the effect of extracting a degree of respect in return. So actually setting the conditions, or trying to as well analyze the conditions, as being ones of some epistemological, cultural, conceptual difficulty and so on, I think is extremely important and helpful. I'll just say one last word, which is I think there's a mode of argument that is much neglected. And that's, I'll just call this aspectual inference. And aspectual inference has the form, look at it like this, or think of it like this. And the natural mode or locus of that really is in things like art criticism, art appreciation, and so on. If somebody says, I don't really understand how anybody could like this, or what there is to be found in this piece of music, or whatever else it may be, one way of engaging with that is to say, look at it like this, bring it under this aspect. And I think that what we need to do in defending positions which I think we generally would hold in common is to find ways of saying to people with whom we're in argument, look at it like this. See it like this, see it under this aspect, as opposed to simply, as it were, invoking first principles and trying to, as it were, proceed deductively from those first principles. There is scope, there is a place for deductive inference, there's a place for abductive inference, but there's also a place for what I'm calling aspectual inference. Anyway, a longer story, that was a short version. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a brilliant demonstration about how to say profound things very quickly. So I take from that Aristotelian notion of friendship based on rationality is not applicable to our current situation, or difficilmente. Yes, and we have to be. All right. So you want to hear me talk? You want to hear our speakers talk? So in any case, our second speaker is John Waters. I've been reading about him. I heard his talk last year, which was quite remarkable. Or 2 years ago it was, 2 years ago, I think. And he's, I think, a fixture at these conferences and well known to you, so you don't need me introduce him. I read all about him, and I realize that I am indeed only half an Irishman. But he was a correspondent for the Irish Times for many years, and I think he's beloved in this group above all because of his willingness to stand up for the unborn, and for the courage he's had to do that, and also to take the punishment that goes with doing that. So we've talked about the problem of maintaining civic friendship, and now we're going to hear about the problem, I suppose, of losing friends.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I can't hear you. I'm deaf in this ear, so if you want to heckle, do it this side. A friend of mine told me a story of something that happened to him. He, like me, is a member of the community of the cancelled in Ireland. A great journalist, and I'll explain a little bit more about him later. But this particular episode, he had been banished from his work. He is now, I guess, unemployable. He worked for a leading Irish newspaper. One day he was in a local hotel and with a friend, and across the lounge he saw 3 former colleagues approaching. They were old friends of his in the past. They had been old friends. They were now all retired. He hadn't seen them since the the calamity that had destroyed his life and his work and his reputation, which I'll elaborate on later. I want him here to speak for all of us in a way. And as the 3 men approached across the lobby of the lounge, he got out of his chair and went to approach these old friends whom he hadn't seen for a long time. And they were by then coming in single file towards him. And he went towards the first one, whom he described to me in the warmest terms, the friendship they had, and put out his hand and said his name. And the other guy kept moving. And as he passed, he touched his outstretched hand and walked on. And the other 2 did exactly the same thing in succession. To me, this was one of the most chilling illustrations of what has happened to our culture and to our civilization. That these were people who knew this guy. They knew him well. They knew everything about him. They knew his faults and his foibles, his excesses. But something about it, something about what had happened, caused them to do this. It is not, I believe, that they believed the accusations made against this man, which were entirely baseless, and I'll explain in a few minutes why. They're completely more than baseless. You might say about this man that he was the direct opposite of what he was accused of being. And this is not a coincidence. It's not accidental. There are many ways you could try to analyze what's happening with the use of these words: racist, anti-Semite, homophobe. In a certain sense, they're meaningless words. They're not words that have any meaning in our general culture. They're manufactured words, ideological words. And perhaps the most important thing to be said about them is that they're always leveled at someone who is innocent. Innocence is essential. To be accused of being a homophobe, you must not be in any way a hater of homosexuals. Because if you were going around beating up gays, there would be no point in calling you a homophobe. They wouldn't be interested in you. They do it precisely to warn everybody, we can come for you too. You're not safe. You need to do what we say if you want to stay safe. Roger Scruton, the great English philosopher, calls these spell words, which I think is a great concept, because they're not words that convey information or knowledge or opinion or anything. They're words that they're like weapons. They're spell words. Homophobe. It sticks to you like glue. It's a tar and feathering in a word. And when that happens to you, there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot defend yourself. There is no answer because there is no charge. It isn't an accusation that you can answer. It is simply a label that sticks to you forever. And now, forever means literally that, because on Google, on Wikipedia, that's who you are once this is said of you. This is a new kind of warfare. It's a new kind of politics. So my own story. By the way, just before I move on, that touch, I call it the hangman's handshake. A touch. Because the hangman, the famous English hangman, Albert Pierrepoint, wrote a great book. And it was clear that he had great compassion for the people he killed. And I've translated that touch in this particular context that I've described. It's something like this. We do not outrightly reject you as a fellow member of the human community. But you have been reckless in your truth-telling, and so have left us no alternative. Socially, professionally, in all the ways that matter, recognizing you would be tantamount to suicide. This is what it means. A space opens up around you, forever. People will walk around you like the way they walk around beggars in the street. My own story, I was voluntary, I was self-cancelled. I quit the Irish Times in 2014 after being attacked by my colleagues, some of them on Twitter, one particular friend of mine, anonymously. I'll come back to the friendship thing in a while because it's a double-edged sword, this. I've been listening carefully to some of the talks and it made me think more deeply about what had happened in this way. I'll come back to that, I hope, if we have time. But I was called a homophobe on TV. Now, the only reason there were several reasons. I hadn't spoken to my discredit. I'm a draft dodger. You know, on these matters, I'm as much as possible, I'm a draft dodger. I don't get involved until the last minute, until it's absolutely essential. When the bishops have all hidden away and everybody has gone to bed and nobody's going to speak, I come and stick my head under the truck. And I then, on the day after, I continued in journalism for a while, for about a year, and then on the day after the gay marriage referendum in 2015, I stopped writing for Irish newspapers for good. I write for First Things these days. That's the only publication I write for. But I did that not because I was scared, not because I was driven out at that point. I could have stayed, although how long I would have lasted is a matter of conjecture. But I did it because I recognized that journalism was no longer journalism, that it had become so corrupted, that it was the police force of ideologies, that the purpose of journalism was to punish those who had dissented, who were dissenting from what was decided for them. And I wanted no part in that. So I quit. Now, there's a history to all this stuff going back, which I'll only just sketch out. I mean, the gay marriage thing, you know, it's quite extraordinary when you actually start to investigate all this stuff. You know, like up until about 2001, the New York Times didn't really write about gay marriage, any of these issues. Up to probably the late 80s, it would have been regarded by today's standards as a deeply homophobic newspaper, the New York Times. Up to the mid-70s, the word gay always appeared in quotation marks in the New York Times. Hard to believe now. Barack Obama didn't become converted to gay marriage until 2012. Hillary Clinton the following year. in every single of the progressive newspapers of the West, if you look back to their archive, you won't find any serious discussion of gay marriage as anything more than a crazy idea up to about 2012, 2013. So this is a Makey upright, and it's important to remember that. But the campaign for it started way back in the 80s. And it started with two guys, Kirk and Madsen were their names, two intellectuals, two gay intellectuals, and they wrote a book called After the Ball in 1989, which basically was a manifesto, a blueprint for how to convert America to the gay agenda. And essentially it's a book which describes in unabashed terms what needs to be done. It describes a campaign of bullying, of demonization, of destruction of character assassination, unashamedly. It says particularly that Christians have to be targeted and attacked and presented as bigots, loud-mouthed assholes is the phrase, or one of the phrases. It's a graphic book. It's not available, unsurprisingly, nowadays, but you can find some of it online in sections. And I had a book out last year called Give Us Back the Bad Roads, and I reconstructed parts of it for a chapter in that book. And it's quite extraordinary reading because it tells you the raw truth of what was done to our societies, which a lot of people, maybe a lot of people in this room, think was some kind of naturalistic phenomenon. It was not. And this thinking was accompanied by something new. I mean, Douglas Murray, the great English journalist, writer, has a new book out called The Madness of Crowds, where he deals with these questions: feminism, LGBT, race politics, and transgender. And in that he believes, because there's a mystery about when, if all of us can remember a time, perhaps in this room, all of us can remember a time before any of this stuff happened, when you didn't have to have conversations about what the LGBT thugs were doing in your town, in your school, in your community. When you didn't have to talk about transgender. When it was kind of like something bizarre. And that's maybe in the last, I would say in Ireland, it's certainly within the last decade that it happened. I would say around the end of 2013. In America, somewhat earlier, for sure. But certainly no more than 20 years ago did this begin to manifest itself as a real problem. Douglas Murray offers the theory that it's to do with the economic crisis of 2008. His logic, I think, being something like, well, because people began, particularly younger people, began to lose their prospect of material prosperity, that they directed their attention elsewhere into these agendas. I don't buy that. I think there is something else that we need to look at. There's a phrase called post-materialism, which I think is relevant. It's post-materialism being this moment when all our material our needs are satisfied and we're looking for diversion, which is in part Douglas Murray's theory. But I think there's something more. There's also social media. Now, I don't think that I keep talking. I've never been on Twitter and never will be on Twitter, and you know, I find it extraordinary. It seems to me that if in 25 or 30 years there is a sentient person alive in the Western world capable of doing research, and they go to look to find, well, what is the root cause, the driving agent of the catastrophe that has brought Western civilization to its knees, I think they will probably come up with one word, and that word will be Twitter. And when I say that to people on our side, they kind of go quiet and start then to equivocate. And I said, you're on Twitter, aren't you? So we're all compromised to the extent that we're involved in this, because it is a decivilizing instrument. Twitter is probably the most dangerous, insidious instrument that has ever been introduced to our culture, in my opinion. The journalist I was talking about before is Kevin Myers. Kevin Myers is one of the great journalists. He was a war correspondent. He was in all the hotspots all over the world. Very brave man, beautiful writer, has written several books. If you can find his book about the Northern Ireland Troubles, which he covered for the Irish Times, it's called Watching the Door. Brilliant, brilliant book. This guy is now unemployable, one of the great talents of Irish journalism. A literary journalist, a rare thing. Unemployable because of a gang of thugs online, on Twitter, who started at 2 o'clock in the morning on the night the article that was being attacked came out. In other words, several hours before it hit the streets. They knew already. And the allegation was that he was an anti-Semite. Well, immediately the Irish Jewish Society came out and said, no, he is the opposite of an anti-Semite. He's been the most decent and protective voice in Irish journalism for Jewish people. Made no difference. Facts don't matter. Because why? Because this is something, there's a phrase, availability cascade, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I don't like it. The availability comes from the idea of activists becoming available to attack people. And the cascade is then the way they sort of create this herd of abuse, this a swarm of locusts in your direction. And I would call it an assassination cascade. That's really what it is. And that's the instrument by which our civilization is being altered. Because anybody who dares to dissent, anybody who dares to continue telling the truth, they will wait for their moment and they will get him or her. And nobody will stand up. Nobody will defend you. Nobody. There are no adults left. Once, in the university, in the newspaper, in politics, in the public realm, there was somebody who would just say, shut up, sit down, listen. No more. They run. Worse, they side with the aggressor. Robert Bly wrote a book 25 years ago called The Sibling Society, where he predicted that the future would be a society of siblings, that we would lose the vertical line of culture, would be replaced by a narrow band of horizontal culture just between a generation, which might be 3 or 4 years of a band, and there would be nothing but half adults. And this graphic image, I said, children pummeling the chests of their fathers and calling them fascists. Well, there we are. This is it. My friends, I've had a new thought about this, which, to my great shame, I hadn't really given any thought to. Because I lost many of my friends in this, mainly journalists, former colleagues, who just couldn't take it, couldn't take the heat. And I blame them for that to some extent, but I want to revise that a little bit now. Journalism is a strange profession, you know. I used to think that journalists were serious when they say, we like you because you're different. Editors would tell me that. Come and write in our newspaper because you're different. Immediately you came in, they wanted to change you to be like them. And then I realized that the reason that they talk so much about this diversity of opinion thing is that what they want is you to affirm their opinions by joining in with them. Because this shows all the more. It's like the lost sheep, you know? The one who is lost. There's more rejoicing in the editorial boardroom. That's kind of the way it works. So there is this groupthink. It always struck me going to meetings in the Irish Times for years that, you know, the need for love of the human being is probably the most insidious and dangerous thing in terms of democracy. Because our desire to be approved of by other human beings is the thing which causes us to think like other human beings when we don't really necessarily feel that these are, or think that these are the right thoughts. This happens, I saw it for many years in editorial rooms where even when somebody dissent, they would keep silent. And people begin sentences. You do see, it happens, it is now viral in society. People walk up to you in the street and they say something about Donald Trump and expect you to agree with them like that. I mean, they expect you to respond in like manner. It never occurs to them that you might have a different opinion. And there are certain things. Brexit is another one. And these are not, that's not a coincidence. I'll come back to that if I have time. And the reason also that I left journalism was because the referendum was fixed. Completely fixed. It was won by propaganda, bullying, lies, demonization, what I've been talking about. Also by fiddling the electoral register. There are over 500,000, were then and still are, over 500,000 extra votes on the electoral register in Ireland. Now in America that wouldn't be a lot of votes. In Ireland it's a hell of a lot. It's about 20%. Votes that nobody can account for. Most likely people who are voting at least twice, registered at least twice, illegal immigrants, people who are not entitled to vote, and so on. All of whom have been signed up to vote by state authorities, including the police. The police would have had to be involved in this for it to happen. And nobody shows the slightest interest in changing it. So all of the referendums, the last two referendums, have been won fraudulently, under that heading and others. I want to just talk briefly about the meaning of this. I think there's a divide. I mean, John talks about different divides, and you know, we, in the feminist men versus women, gays versus straight, black versus white, so on. Rural versus urban is another one. I think there's an actually more fundamental divide that nobody's really talking about. And it has to do with work, the way we work. And I kind of see this because I was the first person in my family to be involved in sedentary work, not to work with his hands, with his physical labor. My father and mother come from farming families. My father was a mechanic and a carpenter and all kinds of things. So it's a divide, I believe, between the concrete and the virtual. The people, the concrete world, people who make, mend, clean, scrub, cook, and otherwise make the world manifest on a day-to-day basis. And on the other, there is what we used to call the pin pushers, which includes us, I'm sorry to say. But we may be the good pin pushers. But nevertheless, it's a real divide. Now, it's always existed, of course. But in the past, everybody, from the clerk to the philosopher, on that side, the sedentary side, fitted into the concrete world. And were honoured. My grandfather, who was born in Sligo, like all my family on that side, was 7 years older than William Butler Yeats, the poet, who used to hang around Sligo quite a lot. I don't know that they ever met face to face, but they probably did. There was 7 years between them. And if they had, I can know that the relationship within them would have been one of mutual respect, of veneration for the role each played. The necessity for the farmer, the necessity for the poet. This synthesis is leaving our society, our civilization. It is now, there's a gap opening up between the two. And if you look closely at what's happening, you can see that this is where the conflict really is. Trump, think about the Trump phenomenon. The people who vote for Trump. I was myself and Rita, my wife, have been in New York a few times recently, and a couple of years ago we went for the first time to a place called Italy, which is on the junction of Broadway and Fifth Avenue near the Flatiron Building. It's a huge market of Italian food. It's also got restaurants and cafes sprinkled throughout it. Nice place, you know, I'm not a foodie, but it's a nice place. But the first time I was there, I said to Rita on the way out, you know, not once in the history of this place has a Trump supporter crossed that threshold. Not once. I don't believe I'm wrong about that. But if you drive 30 miles out to a diner, in any direction probably, and go in there, you'll see guys in denims, overalls. They're Trump's people. They're the people who make and fix the world. So what we have now is a class which resents that class. And this class now is in fear, this concrete class is in fear of its life. Because AI is coming down the tracks. And the people on the other side of the discussion are not interested. They regard these people as rednecks, reactionaries, uneducated buffoons. The education thing is interesting. There's a very good book out, came out earlier in the year by two English guys, Matthew Goodwin and Roger Eatwell, called National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. And it's a very interesting, you know that trope that was around the time of Brexit and also Trump, that these were uneducated buffoons who voted for these things. Well, what Goodwin and Eatwell deal with this issue in a very interesting way, because what they actually show is that the defining factor is not education. It's attending university, a different thing. Because what the defining characteristics are that people attend the same clubs, they go to the same meetings, they mix in the same circles, they end up with the same worldview. And that's the key to what's happening, I believe, with Brexit and with Trump. That there's a contempt. But the contempt is based, I believe, on envy. If you read Matthew Crawford's book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, a wonderful book about working with your hands, and he talks about the idea of the carpenter, whom is governed by his spirit level. He's governed by things outside of himself. And in a second book, The World Outside My Head, he develops that in terms of post-Enlightenment thinking. And he comes up with a very interesting observation, maybe it's not new, it was new to me, that it's working with our hands that makes our thinking true. That's how the human race learns about the world. I have a little step-grandson called Mark, and he goes around, and everything he sees, he takes it up and he turns it upside down, he rolls it around, he puts it in his mouth. He's doing it all the time. And if a human being left alone will do that to the world right through. But at a certain point in our culture now, this gets interrupted. When that experience becomes abstracted, and the person doesn't learn firsthand about the world, they're told what the world is. And this is essentially what a university does. It gives them a version of the world which is not experiential. And this is the divide, I believe, that is opening up in the world. And the reason I think it's jealousy. Because there is a power struggle that this new, yes, parasitic class is seeking to suggest that it is superior to those who make and mend the world. It is the peel masquerading as a fruit. And because we are part of that class, I believe we have a responsibility to restore the unity that once existed between us and those who have their showers in the evening. Because they and we have a common cause, which is to defeat a new delusionalism, which is based on an abstracted form of thinking that has no roots in reality. That's why it's so incoherent. That's why when you say they demand gender balance, and they say there are now 72 genders, but they only want balance for one gender. How come? What about the other 71? That's a satirical question, by the way. So that's pretty much all I think I have to say for the moment. Aristocracies. G.K. Chesterton spoke about, to bring it all together, about the danger that when journalism would become a monstrosity. I'm paraphrasing somewhat. If, at the moment from which journalists had become an aristocracy, and essentially what we're dealing with here in the modern world is all of these, a coalition of aristocracies seeking to claim the world from the people who, honouring God on a daily basis, make, remake, and fix the world. Thank you very much.
Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So who has a good question? Yes, in back. You're very confident.
We're not going to answer them unless you decide it's a good question.
I'll let the three of you arbitrate that. My name is Isaac Kimmel. I'm a PhD student in sociology here at Notre Dame. And I've done a fair amount of reading on cognition and morality and the way that stated values and stated beliefs and the way that we logically articulate them are actually posterior to values and really emotional values that we hold close to the core of ourselves and really struggle to articulate when pressed. And Professor Haldane, I think you were touching on this a little bit. Or something close to it, perhaps. What I'm wondering is, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, is it possible that the cultural shift that we're seeing, and Mr. Waters, that you were discussing, is not so much a shift toward a set of values that's more emotive, a set of values that's more exclusionary, a set of values that's more reactionary, but that all value systems, including our own, are exclusionary and emotivist and reactionary. And what we're seeing is not a change in the culture that's rejecting discussion, but merely a rise in a new set of values that's oppressing us until we're noticing it for the first time. Is that a good question?
Good enough.
Well, one thing that I was observing, of course there are changes in values, that's obviously the case. I mean, I don't mean changes in what are authentic values, I just mean sociologically speaking, there's a shift and so on. I think to understand why that happens, or at least in some cases why it happens, one has to look in the way that Marxists encouraged us to look, the early Marx certainly, at the material conditions of culture and society and so on. And there's no question that if you change, if you change, for example, means of communication and speed of communication, you change people's conception of time and space, for instance. And what seems remote becomes proximate and things of this sort. And that itself resonates across the fabric of people's concepts. But no, I mean, I think there has been a genuine degradation in the quality of people's thinking. As I said, I think there's sort of two stages to that. One is relativism. I think people have just lost track of the idea that in the sphere of the practical, I'm using the practical in the sense that it encompasses the ethical and so on, that there is such a thing as right thinking. That's one thing, but I think within relativism, within the shift, there's been a secondary shift, which is what, as I said, I call this a distinction between cognitive and emotive relativism. So you could be a relativist and still think that as well you have to cast your arguments in the mode of knowledge, belief, evidence, and so on and such like, right? You might just think that the standards are relative to a culture or whatever else it may be. But what's noticeable is that people don't even put it that way. As I said before, they will use the language of offence, or they will say this is hurtful, or something of that sort. So it isn't even about, it's not as we're disputing people's arguments. It's saying, I don't care what you're saying, this is hurtful to me, or this is offensive to me, as if this was relevant. Now, of course, it may be relevant to the question as to how one expresses oneself, and one has to be respectful and cautious in various ways, but, things have to be said. And the idea, I mean, this is really an aspect of this as well, that's just threatening if you say this. I just given it, this is recorded, so I don't actually want to give too many examples. But anyway, I've been in situations, for example, the BBC programme, where the programme was interrupted, by the producer. And so the thing was sort of rerun again. because it was felt that certain things wasn't helpful, I think was the way to put it. It wasn't helpful to be saying that because this might be hurtful to some of the people who were listening. Well, I mean, this is hopeless, right? Anyway. So that's all I have to say.
Can I just add to that? I think there's an interesting phenomenon now, if you actually look at YouTube, and you see that the vast majority of those who are successful on YouTube with videos are people on the so-called right side of the argument, the conservative side of the argument. They make very coherent, lengthy, discursive videos. The left, so-called, is not the left. I don't believe it's the left. I think that's a fundamental mistake because they've abandoned their own constituency, as I was showing there. They don't operate on YouTube because, why? They work well on Twitter because one-liners work there. And the reason for that is that their arguments are incoherent, fundamentally. And that's why they go so crazy. It's when you're getting to the heart center of their incoherence. All they can do is call you names and issue their spell words. They don't have arguments because fundamentally the different elements of their agenda do not fit together. I mean, they tell you, as Douglas Murray says, they tell you that transgender is hardware in the human person. You're born like that, and therefore it's not nothing to do. You can't be. It's not a choice, right? But they tell you that being a woman is not. It's software. So that's a choice. Being a woman is a choice. This is part of their ideology now. And if you dissent from that in our country, and I think in others, within a very short time, you will be charged with hate crime. If you disagree with this crazy, ridiculous proposition, you will be locked up, potentially. So, I don't think that your question is, I don't think that the implication of your question is correct. I think that there are so many holes in the other side of the argument that the only reason that we're not winning the argument is because of the corruption of the referee, which is the press.
Yes. Yes.
My name is Amanda Erwin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto in political theory. My question is, I guess both of you can speak of it, but it's mostly directed to Mr. Waters, which is, so I've had the experience of losing friends as well, standing up for various things like dignity of life, despite efforts to phrase it in ways that are congenial and respectful. And I guess at this conference I've heard so much about the virtues necessary to maintain friendships. And I was wondering if you could speak about the virtues necessary to let go of friendships. What comes to mind is courage, but...
Yeah, sorry, I can't. One of the problems of my condition is I don't know where any sound is coming from, so I have no idea where you are. But yes, I was thinking about this very point today, actually, when I was listening to some of the talks here. And it struck me that actually that's the thing I was meant to say about all these friends that I've lost. That, maybe it was my fault in a certain way as much as it was theirs. Because the fault I was not their friend either. I was not their friend because I didn't tell them the truth. We avoided certain subjects. That was the way we maintained our friendship. They knew what I stood for, but we never discussed it. And perhaps if we had, we'd either have said, okay, that's it, see you around, or we would have moved to a new place. I think that's a thing which I think it's very much true of, perhaps it's more true of men than of women. I'm not sure about that part. I won't generalize. But I know I have nephews who I have relationships like which are good but not deep. And one of them uses this phrase, the bant. That you can have a relationship, he called it the bant, which is just a phrase for banter. That you can have a relationship which is based entirely on banter. A lot of male relationships are like that. So I think that the virtue that we need in relation to our friends is to actually tell them who we are, fully, unapologetically. But without any accusation, without any expectation that they will necessarily agree or respond in a positive way. I think that we cannot now, I think any longer, I must face the fact that I cannot any longer think I have a friendship if the person in question doesn't know everything about my opinions about the world. And secondly, that there's a second dimension of that I have a responsibility to lead that person to the truth. And I have failed in that regard as well. And maybe the losses of friendship that I have incurred are a reflection or a measure of that failure of my own.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that just one thing to mention here, one needs to build one's resources, spiritual, moral, but let me just say intellectual for a moment. I think that one thing, it's very significant that where these matters have been most, or among the places where these matters have become most conflicted, and where the sort of thing that you were describing is most manifest, in my experience, is in Ireland, in Scotland, and I see John Finnis is there, in Australia as well. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that these cultures are ones that suffer an inferiority complex. They're each countries that feel, because in Scotland because of its Presbyterian past, in Ireland because of its Catholic past, in Australia because it's Irish past. The thing is that, you see, an inferiority complex, strictly speaking, is not thinking less well of yourself, it's thinking that other people think less well of you. But of course, thinking that other people think less well of you tends to have a causal, has to produce the effect of thinking less well of yourself. And these are very insecure cultures in terms of these changes. And so what's happened in each of these places is they're very, very, very keen to demonstrate to the world that they're not just caught up, but they're ahead, as it were, of the progressive curve. So that, the Irish are very keen to let it be seen, that they're really at the cutting edge. I arrived in Paris on the day after the Brexit vote in the UK, and I was greeted, I was there for an academic meeting, and I was greeted by friends who assumed that I would be lamenting national activities. This is just the point you were making, right? And actually I said, well, I think there was something to be said for the Brexit and so on, such like. And they just, the chill that descended, right? But the parent, this is somebody you might know, but I won't mention names. But the person who was most aggressive in response to this was an Irishman. And there's a saying that was current in Scotland in the 1707 or 1706, I suppose, in the debate leading up to the union of the parliaments, and it was bought and sold for English gold. Well, it seems to be, one might say of Ireland, it was a country that was bought and sold for euro gold. And this is true of many European countries, actually. But part of what you got when you did the deal was that you just shut up. Right? That is to say, don't put up any resistance to this sort of progressive agenda of the European Union and so on. And so I think it is significant. And it's an interesting feature, for example, Scotland. Now, Scotland is desperate to leave the United Kingdom, but to join, particularly under the prospect of Brexit, desperate to join the European Union. And I'm inclined to say bought and sold for euro gold. But I think this question of insecurity is very important. That it has to have the confidence of one's views and not just, not worry about what people think about them. But that's an obvious point.
What explains the United States and Canada with this young woman?
Well, Canada actually, sorry.
Might buy in
Yeah.
on the your Irish.
No, I'm not sorry. I'm not saying that. Yeah, I can see why you might not. Yeah, it's not. It's two things. Right. First, it's not meant to be a sufficient explanation. It's just a remark about why, in countries that you might have expected would be resistant to this because of their historical past, it's quite the other way. They're so keen to ditch that past and to announce to the world that they have done. So Scotland was seen as a sort of, rather conservative country. So actually, Canada is another interesting case in point because Canada suffers from the same psychological inferiority, in the sense that it's just something, there's a country that people in the United States don't even know is there.
We have to leave it there, and a very good place to leave it. Canadian receptionist.